today we're doing, again, section 5.1. We're going to be in the second day of this. We're going to be in section 5.1 for several days because they progressively get harder. Again, one thing I want you to understand is when I'm doing these problems, you might think to yourself, well, I would have done this differently. There's multiple ways to go about these problems and still verify the identity. So do not think that the way I show you is the only way possible. So for our first example, we're going to do cosine of x minus cosine of x times sine squared of x equals cosine cubed of x. So when you're doing this problem, most common mistake is students think that those cosines cross out. They do not cancel out because this cosine is attached to that sine. What we can do, however, is factor out a cosine since both terms have a cosine in common. So if I pull this cosine out front, I have 1 minus sine squared of x. And I want you to look back at the list of the identities that you copied down from the video yesterday and notice that the Pythagorean identity of sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1 can be manipulated. So when I have subtract that sine squared over, and now I have 1 minus sine squared, well, that formula was left with a cosine squared on the other side. So I know that this can be replaced with cosine squared. So I have a cosine squared in here. And now a cosine times a cosine squared is cosine cubed. So I verified the identity. All right, let's try another one. Okay, here we have 1 plus sine of x over cosine of x. And this is equal to secant of x plus tangent of x. So I would still say that the left-hand side is the more difficult of the two sides, and I want you to notice, looking at the right-hand side, that I have these two different terms, and they're being added together. So because I have two terms, and on the other side I have one fraction, I want to see if I can split it up into two terms. So when you split a fraction up, these are both being divided by cosine. So think about what a step would look like before when we had common denominators. Like if they both had common denominators, we keep the denominator and add the numerator. So we're kind of doing the opposite here. We're splitting it up. So if I were to split this up, I'd have 1 over cosine of x plus sine over cosine of x. So again, it's essentially like you're doing the opposite. You're working a step backwards from common denominators. 1 over cosine, that's the reciprocal identity, so that's a secant. And sine over cosine would be our quotient identity, and I know that is tangent. So in 2 steps, we verify this identity. All right, let's try this one. All right, so here our example is sine squared of x times the quantity of 1 plus cotangent squared of x equals 1. So again, clearly the left-hand side is the more difficult of the two, so that's where we're going to start. And I'm going to say let's distribute. So I'm actually going to show you this problem twice. I'm going to show you two completely different ways to go about it. So if I distribute this in, sine squared times 1 will be sine squared. Sine squared plus cotangent times cotangent squared will be plus sine squared of x times cotangent squared of x. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so now I want to think about getting everything in terms of sine and cosine. So I know cotangent is cosine over sine. So if it's cotangent squared, it's the same thing, it's just they're both squared. So I have sine squared of x plus sine squared of x. And instead of writing cotangent squared, I'm going to say that this is cosine squared of x over sine squared of x. And now that you can kind of see this, when I'm multiplying these two fractions together on the right-hand side, those sine squareds are going to cancel. So I have a sine squared on the top and I have a sine squared on the bottom, so they're going to cancel. Which means I'm just left with cosine squared. So now I have sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x. And this is one of our Pythagorean identities, so I know sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. So again, I've verified my identity. So let me show you the same exact problem a different way. And again, I want you to understand that there's multiple ways to go at this problem. So again, starting with the same problem, sine squared of x consequently 1 plus cotangent squared of x equals 1. So some of you might have been thinking when I started this problem, well, why is this so confusing? Why isn't it using the Pythagorean identity? So you could also use the Pythagorean identity. So if you look at the rest of the Pythagorean identity, you'll see 1 plus cotangent squared of x, and that's equal to cosecant of x. Cosecant squared, sorry. So here, I have sine squared plus times the cosecant squared, and I know cosecant is the reciprocal of 1 over sine. So even though it's squared, that idea still remains the same. So I could say that cosecant squared is the same thing as saying 1 over sine squared of x. And now when I multiply these together, I get sine squared of x over the sine squared of x. And when you have the same thing top and bottom, they're going to cancel out, and I'm left with 1. So again, that's a different way to go about the same exact problem. So all of these problems have several different ways to approach them. So that's all for today. We'll pick up with this in class tomorrow.